Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mind Blown Zone, episode 23. This one is What Causes Disease, part 3. So here's what's going down today. Today, Brad will discuss his experience and current training in German new medicine, including a brief look at chronic disease, allergies, and depression and mania, according to Dr. Harmer. We also reiterate some important points about what can and cannot be confirmed as true or false at this stage. Finally, we discuss a potential path toward healing that requires no further knowledge beyond a psychological reorientation, which is within the grasp of anybody with the will to become healthy again. Excited about this, Brad?
Bravo. I'm very excited. This is an addendum to a two-parter. Can't wait to get it out there.
Well, why don't you take it away?
All right, I'm taking it away. So Matt suggested this a couple of podcasts ago, and I agree. I just want to discuss my knowledge of GHK so everybody understands. I learned about this in June of 2020. I remember very specifically because that was a paper that was put out by a guy named Dr. Stefan Lanka. You heard me talk about him in the virus podcast. He's kind of the ultimate linchpin of proving the non-existence of boogeyman viruses. And in that paper, he referenced German New Medicine, or GHK, or Germanisch Heilkunde, goes by many names today. And that started my journey. I looked into it. I read a little bit about it and got curious. And really, for those last 6 months of 2020, I was just kind of poking and prodding at it. I wasn't attempting to study it per se. But I looked at some of, and this is what I recommend to most people, is I looked at some of the diseases that I had in my past and went and tried to see if I could make a correlation between what Dr. Hammer suggested was the cause and whether or not something like that had really gone on in my life. And sure enough, it made a lot of sense. I think I talked about my strep throat as a child before as one of the real big ones, because I had that like a dozen times as a kid. And I, of course, didn't want to swallow something. And in that case, it was vegetables. So that was what really said, this guy may be onto something. And so that's when I started to more formally start to study it in early 2021, started to get some courses, some information from other teachers. And right now I am enrolled in what's called the GHK Pilhar Academy course. And it's a 2-year course that started just this year. So we're about 8 months in. So that's my experience with it. And I have, during all this time, I've worked with dozens of people, maybe hundreds now, either friends, family, friends of family, et cetera, acquaintances, people I've met online, et cetera, and tried to help them with some of their issues. And so far, by and large, I can't find a flaw in what Dr. Hammer suggested. Now, there's some people who have not been fully disclosed everything to me. And some people I just had brief encounters with. So I can't say, with 100% certainty, but in general, I would say anybody who I've worked with consistently over time, I've seen the correlation between what Dr. Hammer suggests and what their particular disease is that's manifesting. And I think Matt falls into that category. While he had solved most of his issues before he met me, I think you saw, obviously, almost immediately the correlation between what Dr. Hammer was suggesting and your fibromyalgia, right?
Oh yeah, and allergies and things like that, and just other like slight diseases in all sorts of categories, not like full blown things that I like have a big life issue about, but just like little symptoms here and there.
Right.
And basically how we met was, you were posting stuff about health and spirituality and political stuff on a forum, and we exchanged some private messages, and Brad just sent me this learninggnm.com site, and I just took a look at it, and straight away I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I read the whole thing over 3 months or so. And it's just fascinating because the way it's structured is you can just look up any disease. You can just look it up and it will just explain everything about it. Like it's just incredible. And when I say everything, I mean, it will talk about the things that you're experiencing in life, like your life situation, your life conflicts that are feeding that disease. And I was like, oh man, every single time this thing's just accurate. not like 100% accurate, but like 98% accuracy. Like only very rarely would I be like, that doesn't quite match up. But I immediately saw that there was something absolutely incredible to this. Like it seemed like, wow, this guy went off and just figured out every single disease, in spite of the medical establishment. It was incredible. And I got back to you and said, "Hey, yeah, I read all that stuff." And you were like, "Whoa, really? You read all that?" Nobody actually goes and reads that. I'm like, "Yeah, I read it all."
Yeah, you're a rare breed in that regard. I've told this to well over 100 people, and only a tiny handful have made any effort to research it. Which it can feel a little daunting, but I would think if you had a health problem that was really troubling you, you'd want to absolutely check this thing out, understand it, make sure that you get the gist of it, and see if you can't correlate it. That seems to me that would be the most logical thing to do. But a lot of people just don't, for reasons I don't yet understand. And I guess this last bullet here is what basically I just I have the advantage that I haven't been a holistic naturopathic alternative medicine person for 2 3 4 decades, such that my my business and my revenue is all tied into this realm. So I had that advantage. I was just looking for answers, and that's what led me here. So I can understand, I guess, why some people don't want to, or they would like to ignore this research, because they've already decided that their particular modality or health system is correct. But it's a tricky spot. And what I want to repeat here again and again, I said it in the other 2 podcasts, I want to say it again, is that this is the only health modality there is that offers disease causation explanations. No other one does it. People think or believe that the mainstream establishment, Western medicine, does, but they don't when pressed, as we pointed out in the previous podcast, and we'll point out a little bit more here today. But they, germs, throw them out. Genes, carcinogens, toxins, diet, lifestyle, these are the biggies, right? There's no scientific studies that prove those out. And, I'm sure we'll get some pushback from people who hear this and suggest otherwise, but we can go through those when the time comes, and we can look at those papers, and we can show that, obviously there are problems, flaws, statistical changes, and a whole bunch of other things that can be done in the medical research to make it appear that something might have been a cause. And in fact, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, the former editor of, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine, said, it could have been the other one, JAMA, I think was the other one, but she was an editor there for many years. And when she retired or quit back in 2013, 14, 15 timeframe, she said over half of the all medical papers published in my journal are not correct, false in one way or another. Now, is over half 51%, or, is it 99%? We don't know for sure, but it's clear that there is, the peer review process, the medical journal process is not what it's made out to be. And it should never be held out as definitive proof, because it clearly isn't, as I've hopefully pointed out in the prior 2 podcasts. Okay. So I also wanted to say that it's important to distinguish between dis-ease and these other things that are not dis-eases, so to speak, right? Poisoning is one such thing that people, especially in the terrain theory group, will push back a little bit on me with this idea, where poisoning is something that happens relatively quickly. You swallow a bottle of Drano, or you inhale mercury fumes or something, you're going to have some immediate problems, and that is a poisoning event. Your body is poisoned by some substance, and that is what a poisoning is. A poisoning isn't that you ate GMO cereal for 25 years with Roundup on it, and eventually that gave you stomach cancer. That is not an example of poisoning. Now, that's what people in the terrain realm will indicate, but of course there's no proof of that. And if we look at Dr. Hummer's work, we can see he's got an entirely different explanation for stomach cancer. So, and that idea that they try to put forth that it's your diet, your lifestyle, your exercise, your food. While those things are all important, we don't want to be junk food junkies. They aren't what cause disease, according to Dr. Hammer. So another one is physical accidents. So that should be obvious to everybody. But, if you get in a car wreck and break your leg, right, that's not a disease, right? That's an actual physical accident. And the last one, of course, is severe malnutrition, right? If you see somebody in a sickly, weakly condition and you find out they haven't had any food for a couple months, that's the reason that they're sick and diseased is because they have not had any malnutrition. So want to get those out of the way just to make sure those have been cleared up. Making sense, Matt?
Yeah. I mean, I was just as you've gone through them, I was thinking, the primary symptoms that you'll get from those things, sure, are not disease, but you can also have disease about them afterwards, right? So you might get poisoned and your body can, take care of that. But you might also have a lifetime of chronic disease about that poisoning where you feel like you're unwell due to that thing that's 25 years ago and you're just constantly reinforcing, telling your body, I'm sick, I'm sick, I'm sick. Or if you have a physical accident, the body heals, but you may be 30 years later with chronic pain.
Right.
Because you've condemned your body to be, you've self-devalued it, devalued it, right? And it's just in chronic pain forever. So you can have a secondary disease, even though these primary symptoms are not disease.
Exactly. Yep. So those events can lead to, exactly as you said, some chronic issues, of course. But those aren't disease in the classical sense as we're speaking of in these podcasts. So I've done the no other modality thing, right? So another thing people say, there's no real proof, which enables them to dismiss German New Medicine. And in reality, there's quite a bit of proof out there. Now, the question is what qualifies as proof to somebody? Is it, 500 peer-reviewed studies, or is it, a case backlog of X number of cases? And, I understand this argument that, you can't just go to one website and see a few explanations and say, well, that's proof, even if there's a CT scan there. And I agree with that assessment. I don't know if Dr. Hammer was right about everything that he had to say. I haven't yet encountered people with all 15,000 different, diseases, which I think he boiled down to basically there's only 500, basically what he said. But it looks like 1,000 different diseases when you look at the conflict active phase versus the healing phase. So it's all stems from one cause, but it leads to, he would say, about 1,000 diseases. Anyway, the point here is that we've got enough information to be able to evaluate. If everybody was evaluating based on Dr. Hammer's information, I think we could compile some pretty compelling evidence pretty quickly on whether or not what his assertion was true or not. It sure is far superior strategy than ignoring it. That's my point.
Right. And I think this idea of there is no proof, I find that the people who say that are not being intellectually or scientifically honest. They're really stating their feelings. Like when they say there's no real proof, what they're saying something that sounds intellectual, but what they're really saying is, I don't feel like it's true. Because it's like, wait a tick. What you want to say is like, no, what you need to do to verify this stuff is you need to first go read it all, right? Then you need to observe your life and observe the symptoms that you observe in your life and your life situation and correlate them. And after you correlate about 10, 20 symptoms with life situations, you'll go, whoa, there's a high correlation here. And then you can go talk to other people and say, do you experience this? Do you have this correlation? And then you're like, yep. And you find out all these other people are saying it. And you start to really understand how it works. And then you're like, whoa, this stuff's real. Right. But when people are just hiding from the reality that this is how disease is caused. And so they're saying there's no real proof because, okay, the medical establishment hasn't come along and declared for them that it's true. All right. So they're waiting on that. They're hiding behind that, behind the
Yeah.
scientific medical establishment.
Oh, yeah, it's an excuse. And I think I mentioned this in the previous, but I'll just quickly re-hit it. Dr. Hammer, after he came back to the university in Germany, he started to compile cases, and he handed 20,000 cases to the German medical authority and said, I've made this new breakthrough, and here's, all these different diseases and cases. And so there is proof out there somewhere. Now they took that material, as I understand it, and locked through it in a vault, and told him, Dr. Humber, he had to disavow everything that he had found and not tell it, not use it to help patients in Germany, or else he'd lose his license. And of course, he refused to do that and lost his license. And then got kicked out of Germany and ran around all over Europe, got thrown in prison a couple times in France and other places. And eventually he ended up in Norway, but he was on the run by himself, almost a lone wolf for, the 40, almost, 35 years after he made his discovery. So it's, and anybody who got near him usually ran into problems as well with the establishment. So there's a reason that you can't, readily grab, here are Dr. Hammer's case studies, and here's all the proof that you need, even though there are several doctors who did take and use his teachings and did provide proof. It's all very well suppressed and hidden. So there is some proof out there, but it maybe isn't readily available at our fingertips. So wanted to make that clear. I also wanted to point out that, as I said it earlier, I don't know if Dr. Hammer was right about everything. How can I know? I haven't worked with people, as I said, with all these different diseases, but I certainly can't disprove him at this point. And that's what's important, is that I can't find any the people that I've worked with and the diseases that I've worked with so far. I can't say there's no way this person who had this disease didn't also have the cause in his, prior to the disease. In fact, there's always a pretty viable candidate there. Now, whether the person wants to, come to terms with it and reconcile with it or not, that's a different story. But it's, so far, I haven't seen where the two things don't fit together. So I wanted to dive into these specialty cases because they do afflict a lot of people, and I didn't talk about them. And for people who listen to the prior two podcasts on disease, and they have a chronic disease, and a lot of people have a chronic disease. So, and they may have thought, well, I can't recall back to 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago when this first kicked off to even remember what may or may not have caused it. But why is it still here with me now? And Dr. Hammer came up with this notion called what he called a hanging healing. And we'll talk about allergies in a second here, but they go hand in hand. And what a hanging healing means is someone who doesn't fully resolve a conflict that they had, however many years ago that it was, and they can be triggered by a memory of that was involved with their conflict situation. And this can go on for your entire life. And a lot of times I'll tell one interesting story and one thing about allergies. So here is a good example of this happening. A woman that he worked with that came to him for help had chronic IBS or colitis, problems with her, her digestion and so forth. And she always had it when she was home. She happened to travel a lot. And when she went on the road for business, she never had the problem. And after a month or two of working with Dr. Hammer, they narrowed it down to it's something that's happening. That they thought for a long time it was in her office, but then they realized it wasn't at the office; it was at home when she would get these issues, and it was just like a nightly thing for her. And after slowly narrowing things down, she eventually took her about 3 months to recall. Dr. Hammer told her it was something to do with anger, something she was angry about. She couldn't think of anything she was angry about. Well, as it turned out, about 3 years earlier, her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, had given them her prized drapes for Christmas. And she had, I don't know whether she, sewed them and made them, or whether she purchased them, or whether they were expensive, but it was a tremendous gift for the mother-in-law to give to them. And she, of course, wanted them to use them and hang them in their dining room. And this woman despised these drapes, just despised them. But in the, in the compromise with a husband is it like, this is going to destroy your relationship with my mother, and she's going to, it's going to be awful, and she's just going to be so upset if you don't hang these things. So this woman agreed to hang these drapes. But every time she saw them, she'd long forgotten about them. She's gotten used to them, but every time she saw them, this anger welled up in her that those drapes were there, not so much consciously, but unconsciously. And as it turns out, this was the trigger for 3 years of colitis for this woman. And as soon as she finally took those drapes down, and she never had the problem again. What do you think of that story?
Right. Yeah, well, I think it points to the issue is as to why this stuff seems untrue, right? Or why when it's presented to people there's cognitive dissonance and just denial and there's no real proof and stuff. It's because the cause, always the cause, is something that the person is basically in denial about. Like the cause, you say always.
No, I said very often. Very often.
Very often, right? Like in some way the cause has been repressed, right? In denial, it's been rejected, right? It's been filed away, right? It's like been forgotten. It's been put in a cupboard somewhere. And you say, can't you see that? Can't you think of anything in your life that could be causing this? And it's like, no, I can't think of anything. Like, yeah. And that's why it doesn't seem true, because you try to look through your life and be like, well, I can't see anything in my life that could possibly be the cause of that, so it must not be true. But to get to the cause things, you really do have to dig deep and be willing to go into your kind of, we can call it going to the subconscious stuff to find it.
Right. It takes a lot of detective work sometimes, especially with these chronic diseases. And it's not, it won't be obvious to a therapist working with you. You have to really, the patient really has to think through things. And like I said, this particular, as simple as it sounds, right? Some drapes in your dining room. It took weekly visits with Dr. Harmer for 3 months for this woman to finally figure this thing out. Right. So it's just a good example that it always isn't front and center. And that's typically what a chronic disease is. And when I explain, and the hanging healing is she was fine when she go back to the office or when she went on the road, right? She didn't have it, right? But she didn't fully resolve those stinking drapes in her family room, right? She'd finally come back home after a business trip and it'd just start all over again. So she never gave up, never accepted that those were going to be there forever. Had she done that, come to terms with it, said it's okay, they're just drapes, they're not the end of the world, then she would have not had the anger issue and the colitis.
So every time she sees the drapes, her body is like charging her up with aggression to have some sort of argument with her husband or something like that, to have the drapes taken away.
Well, no.
She's experiencing all these symptoms. Is that the idea?
It's Dr. Hammer calls it an indigestible situation. So she couldn't. So here's the way the alimentary canal works, just for simplicity's sakes here. That's think of it as the most primitive part of us. It's connected to our brain stem, which is our reptilian brain, right, if you will. It's the oldest part of us, and it's what basically every living organism has: a mouth and a spot on the backside to get rid of, to excrete things, and all the organs in between that are in the process of digesting our food and our morsels. Right. So we share this in common with worms and snakes and all other animals and insects and so forth. And so this is this old brain of ours, and it's just all it really focused on is survival. And the indigestible morsel, or indigestible situation, as Dr. Harmer calls it, was that when you feel like in other words, you had to take it into your mouth. So you open your mouth and ate it, and you also swallowed it, right? So you said, I'll swallow this. So she swallowed the situation in the compromise with her husband. So she didn't have any problems with her throat or her esophagus or anything, right? But when it got down to her stomach, and she stomached it, but then it got down into the intestines, and she couldn't digest it. She just couldn't accept it. That's what digestion typically relates to, is acceptance. I can't accept it. And that's why she had repeating problems with digestion. So it was an indigestible situation for her. Make sense?
Well, it certainly seems like the body is there as a manifestation to kind of like show you in material reality what's going on inside, doesn't it?
Yeah, That's right. The body doesn't lie. So and there's a million places we could go with chronic diseases, but that's just an example of a situation and how it takes time to work your way towards the absolute resolution.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the next area I wanted to get into is allergies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I call these subconscious associations. And hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And when I get done with this, you'll be able to comprehend what's going on here. What's really happening is it's a psyche trying to protect you. Here's how it works. Let's say, Matt, you're a young boy, you're 10 years old, and you don't have a cat in your household. But your friend Billy down the street that you play with has a cat. And one day you're over at Billy's house and you guys are roughhousing and knocking stuff over and breaking things. And Billy's dad comes in and scolds both of you, balls you out. I mean, really treats you like crap. And your dad didn't treat you that way, but Billy's dad, he's a little rougher and tougher. And maybe he, throws you guys around a little bit or something, or, smacks you. Who knows? But the point is that's a conflicting situation. You were shocked by that conflict shock. Whoa, Billy's dad's mean. And he screamed at us. That situation, you would in that moment that it was happening, right? You'd have a conflict. You'd be frightened of Billy's dad and you'd be scared. And what happened was, while you were there, your psyche took in all of the everything in that environment, the smells, the sights, the tastes, sounds, everything that it could perceive. It took in that moment that Billy's dad scolded you guys and scared you. Making sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
So now you get over it. You go home. Maybe you don't play over at Billy's house anymore. Who knows what happens? You tell your parents, they don't, whatever happens. But a couple months later, you go over to another friend's house, Jimmy, and Jimmy's got a cat in the house as well. And you start sneezing and wheezing and your eyes are watering and the whole 9 yards. And all of a sudden, maybe your parents take you to the doctor, what's going on? And they find out you're allergic to cats. And for the rest of your life, anytime you get around cats, you get your cat allergy. So this is what has happened here is that while you're at Billy's house and getting scolded by his dad, you were smelling cat dander because they have a cat in the house. And it recognizes that smell. And when it smells cat dander, it is afraid that you're going to get into another conflicting situation. So it wants you to get away from cat dander. And so that's why it makes your eyes water and you're sneezing and wheezing and snotting and all the rest. That's what an allergy is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of chronic physical pains work like allergies in a way. You might have pain in your shoulder or something like that. I could give 1,000 examples, but I know that one pain in my shoulder was just associated with like raising up my hand in class, and the teacher just like, when sometimes you raise your hand, you got your hand up, you're holding it and you're holding it and you're holding it, and for some reason the teacher isn't saying, "Yes, Matthew, what would you want?" And you're like, "What? I'm just going to hold my hand up, and you're just going to act like I'm not even holding it up? Is this what's going down here?
Right?
Do you not see me?" Or something like that. Like, imagine the anger you feel, right?
Right.
This like burning pain in the shoulder that's just there forever because of that unresolved, anger charge there that's associated. So you kind of move your shoulder up into that position. You're like, "Oh, my shoulder hurts," right? And then some marketer comes along and says you need to buy some turmeric to solve the inflammation. It's like, I think it's working.
You need some steroids and shoulder surgery. Another possibility for you. Yeah, that's the idea, is that all these situations in life that we find, conflicting, negative, unfortunate, etc., eventually manifest into the body when they aren't allowed, accepted, let go, forgotten, forgiven, etc. That's what leads to these long-term chronic situations. So that's an allergy. And if there's in order to resolve the allergy, right, that takes some work. You can't just go, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'm not really allergic to cats, so I'm not afraid, I shouldn't sneeze around cats anymore now that I understand this." Well, that's not going to work, right? Because your psyche still thinks that cats are associated with conflicts for you. So it's going to continue, even though you intellectually, consciously are aware of this, it's going to continue to make you sneeze and wheeze every time you're around cats. The way to resolve that particular situation is to actually come to terms with the fact that you don't go play at Billy's house anymore. So you can never, ever have that situation again where you go play at Billy's. Maybe you live on other continents, or he's, isn't around anymore, or whatever. But if you can never get yourself into that situation again, then you can convince your psyche that this is impossible, that this could ever happen to me again, where I would get scolded by a friend's dad. So for that reason, you don't have to protect me from a potential similar situation in the future. So it takes a little bit of work, but that is the type of thing that needs to be done to resolve it.
And even just to bring in the example that I gave again, just to build on what you said there, it's like, I said, okay, there's some anger issue about the teacher not noticing you or something like that. Like, you're not going to resolve that shoulder issue with like a stretch or something like that, right? Like, you may eventually resolve it in that way, but you will not resolve it. The thing that will actually have to take place is that you will have to come to terms with, like not being noticed or something. You'll have to get over your not being noticed by the authority conflict or something like that. And when you do that, then you'll go do some shoulder exercise and you'll be like, whoa, my shoulders. Oh, I think this shoulder exercise just fixed my shoulder. Right. Like, but what takes place first is getting over the mental thing.
Right. There's the intellectual aspect where you now know, okay, there isn't no such thing as allergies to cats, because that's not a real thing. And it's a much deeper subconscious psychological thing where you get back to the root of it and why it happened, and convincing your psyche that it can't happen. And sometimes the thing can happen again, and people can't resolve this even with all this information. So there are cases where it can't be resolved by the person. And sometimes there are cases where it should not be resolved, because it could lead to a whole host of other problems. So the allergies are complex, to say the least, but this is the essence of it. So it's a subconscious association. You're not aware of it. Like the woman wasn't aware of the drapes, that she was still angry about the drapes 3 years later. So it's the same idea here with allergies. So making sense?
Yep.
All right. So the next topic I want to get into, and people ask me about this a lot, is depression mainly. And I have mania here too, but this gets into some complex areas, but I'll explain what Dr. Hammer explained. He eventually, after he'd figured out most of the physical ailments, he came around to looking at psychological ailments. And this research is also fascinating. He named them schizophrenic constellations. It doesn't mean everybody's schizophrenic, as the word is popularly understood, but he just called them that, and to reference them in this. Basically, this idea was that when somebody has a conflicting situation, what happens is it lands on one side of your brain or the other, one hemisphere or the other. It depends on a variety of different things, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, what your hormonal status is, whether you're male or female. None of that's important. But when you have a conflict and you don't resolve it, whatever the conflict is, it can be a whole wide variety of different conflicts. And then you have a second conflict. What happens is that second conflict goes to the opposite brain hemisphere. So if you were a right-handed male, typically normal hormonal status, your first conflict would land on the left side of your brain. Sorry, the right side of your brain. And if you didn't resolve that conflict, and it could be all kinds of different things, then when you have a second conflict, you go into what he calls constellation. And now what happens is the first conflict, whatever changes the psyche was making to your body, whether it was breaking down tissue or adding tissue, adjusting functionality, it stops that moment. And the new conflict now comes into play. And most of the time with these schizophrenic constellations, there are no symptoms, physical symptoms at all with these. But it does throw people into psychological conditions. And there's a whole bunch of them. There's no time to talk about them all, but a lot of people typically associate depression, mania, or manic depressive. Often people with psychological problems have these as well. And what Dr. Hammer discovered was that when these constellations happen, it can raise or lower testosterone or estrogen, and it raises and lowers the levels of these things. And most frequently for right-handed women, most often they get the conflict in the left side of their brain, and then they get the second conflict. And what that does is it lowers their estrogen and it depresses them. And it's not there aren't all these, while there are drugs that make women feel better with their depression, they aren't a solution. That's just a temporary, basically a temporary jolt or boost to the, chemical makeup, but it does not solve the depression problem. The woman has to solve the conflict in order to get out of it completely, or else she needs the drug. And so that's what depression is, according to Dr. Hammer. I've never worked with anybody with any of these yet, so I can't vouch for whether they're true or false. But this is the idea. And when the manic depressive idea is somebody who goes in and out of, they solve their conflict and then they fall back into their conflict. So they go conflict active, healed, conflict active, healed. And that's what a manic depressive is. So they're getting these boosts or drops in testosterone and estrogen. And that's what's causing the erratic behavior. What do you think?
Okay,
Matt?
just see if you can resolve this question then. So, yeah, the way it's been presented by both you and Harmer, they say, okay, you have one conflict, then you have another conflict. Okay. But, we just talked about, okay, a woman with the drapes, and we talked about someone with a conflict about a dog, right? And we talked about, the conflict over a teacher not noticing or something like that. Yeah, that's 3 conflicts right there.
Okay.
And, I got I've had thousands of things like that in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I get confused where it's like you get one conflict and then a second conflict. Like, whoa, 2 conflicts, man. Like, forget 2. Like, I can identify 1,000 conflicts that fit into these kind of categories that we're identifying here. So, how does that work? Like, how do you say there's just one and then wow, a second one?
Well, so specifically when it comes to this depression idea, they land in what he called the territorial area of the brain. And that's the brain relays in our temple area. So on the kind of the sides of our head. And these are what I refer to these conflicts as social contract type conflicts. And
Are you
this is
suggesting that these are a special class of conflict
very much
that are kind of like very above or more powerful than these basic ones that we've mentioned?
well. So the brain, you can break up the brain into essentially 4 different areas. 3, some people argue 3, but you remember I mentioned the reptilian brain or the brain stem as these primitive. Right. These are where typically your classic cancers arise. So the way the reptilian brain reacts is that it increases cells in organs. That's the base brain. Then you get up into the midbrain, and then you get up into the cerebral medulla, which deals more with muscle bone connective tissue, kind of the above the midbrain, and then you get into the cerebral cortex, and that's our new brain. So that's that's where the humans have the big brain, right? The gray matter up on top that you would see when you cut open a skull. And in that area, there are several lobes. There's a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and there's the temporal lobe. And it's in this temporal lobe that deals with our social contracts, if you will, our interactions with basically what people think of us, if you will, or how we feel we're liked or disliked by others. And it's these kinds of things. This is territorial area for men, and it's identity nesting for women. So it's two conflicts that land in these areas that cause the psychological schizophrenic constellations. Does that help a little bit?
So it still seems like you're pointing at like
your
not
shoulder example
not
is
yeah,
the
like
cerebral medulla.
that's still kind of like how come the shoulder, like I just feel like if I had 2 conflicts at the level of the shoulder level, but that still fits into what you're saying, right? You're saying
No,
social contract things. Okay, someone wasn't noticing me. Like, what's different between what you're talking about and my basic ones about,
yours
okay,
are
the
all
teacher didn't notice me?
yours are all self-devaluation. Anytime there's pain in the muscle, bone, connective tissue, it's self-devaluation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's the causal factor. Right? As
Right. So the self-evaluation would be like, what am I not worth looking at? What am I not worth noticing or asking a question? Am I that?
right,
Right.
exactly. Yeah, you were devaluing yourself. I'm not good enough for my teacher or whatever. Or she doesn't like me. Right. That's a self-evaluation. Those do not fall into the schizophrenic constellations. Most
Okay.
of them,
Can you give a couple of examples that do then?
well, for men, it's territorial stuff. I mentioned this in the previous broadcast. So the territorial anger, fear, marking.
But like specific examples rather than just abstraction category labels.
Yeah. So you lose your job. You go to work the next day and the boss says you're fired. Bang.
Right.
That major territorial loss. Huge.
Okay.
Right. You can imagine all the worries that stem from that, but you just lost your job with part of your territory, or you can't pay your mortgage in next month and the bank comes and forecloses on you. Bam. Territorial loss.
So then
Or
okay, we've got the man loses his job. Then can you have a second thing happen to the man that is significant enough? And then could you tie that into the depression and the mania?
sure. Well, so let's just go down the line. I go to work tomorrow and I'm fired. My boss just comes out of nowhere, says I'm fired. Whatever. Doesn't matter for whatever reason. Well, then I go home and I can't find another job for 4 or 5 months and I run out of money and I lose my house. Bang. Second conflict. I haven't gotten over the fact that I got fired and now I lose my house. That, even though it's that, if I didn't have any conflicts, that conflict would have landed on my right brain. But because I haven't solved my territorial loss in my right brain, this one goes to my left brain now. And that's when I go into constellation.
So then what? So you're in constellation. Then what? What kind of symptoms or behaviors are going to manifest out of that?
You're going to get angina pectoris. It's the worst one of the worst. I'm just going to go to the worst one and explain it. Chest
So you
pain.
can actually, that's the beauty of Dr. Harmer's work, right? That you got this particular problem, then this particular problem, then you're going to get that particular symptom.
Right. That chest pain is very much tied to territorial loss in men. And this is the big one, because this is the one that you don't want to solve if it's been going on for more than 9 months. And I'm getting way off target here, but if you had chest pain for, more than 9 months, you want to maintain that chest pain, because the resolution of it is a fatal heart attack. So it's the trickiest one of all. But that's a good example. For women, it's identity related or sexual related that usually come into play. And it can be anything that, they suddenly feel insecure in their home, in their safe space, for whatever reason. Then that can kick off these constellations. But there's a variety. I mean, it's the most complicated part of GNM. So we don't have time to dive into it here today. But it's always related. It's related to how our social interactions, essentially, how we're seen by others, how we relate to other people. It's not, I'm no good, I'm weak. That's a self-evaluation.
Okay.
Making a little bit of sense?
Yeah. Although I think it's worth mentioning that like you got to go over these things like 20 times, and like you've been studying it for years and stuff, and me less, but like yeah, it's just like the categories are so complex and the relationships are so complex that I think people, when they hear it the first time, they just hear it for 10 minutes, they're like, that sounds stupid. But you really do have to go into it and understand it deeply until you start to see the relations, not just intellectually, rationally, but be able to relate them to your own life. Really have to spend some time with it.
Right. And most people are only really motivated, when they have some, debilitating, chronic, long-lasting type disease. Those are the people who get motivated to look into this.
Okay.
For me, I was just bloody curious why I'd never heard of this German new medicine stuff before 2020. So I just kept going and going. And one day, actually, I didn't want to study it, to be honest. And just one day I thought, I think I'll be able to help friends and family for the rest of my life if I learn this stuff. So I think that's a good thing. So that's what did it for me. So far, it's paying off in spades. So that's depression. I just really wanted to talk about depression. We went off on a little sidetrack there. But it's pretty common, especially in women, right-handed women in particular. So what do we got next here? So I wanted to look at the most destructive emotions. And this is according to Prentice Mulford and David Hawkins. Both tend to agree on these things that are really holding humanity back in major ways. And, if you get nothing else out of these podcasts on disease, you can certainly look at these and see if you feel any of these. And it's a good chance that you are going to be suffering from some types of diseases, whether they're come and go or whether they're chronic or whether they've been with you for a long time. And the emotions are at the very bottom of the scale is shame and guilt. Those are the worst of the two. And this goes to the biblical story of Lot and looking back, at the pillar of salt. This is the metaphor, the allegory of that is that we keep looking back at something that happened to us in the past that we feel guilty or ashamed of. And it can really, really lead to some major, major problems. These are the kind of things we have to forgive and forget and let go. Some of the other emotions are, just a general bitterness about life. And usually see that, start to mark up somebody's face when they're bitter. You can see it. You can see a bitter person, over 10, 20, 30, 40 years of bitterness. And it also leads to many diseases. Dread is another. Hatred is very, very powerful. And that's a deep, deep, deep state of judgment, of course. And lastly, on the list of the worst emotions is powerlessness or helplessness. And that's usually tied to depression in many ways. So those are the big nasties. Any comments?
No.
All right. I wanted to dive in one more time. We've talked about genes. We talk about them all the time. And I wanted to throw out Dr. Bruce Lipton's idea about genes. I like it. I think it's a good metaphor and it makes a lot of sense. What he said,
Brad, if I can just ask.
If
I can just ask, Brad. These things that you're talking about here and here, just previously Prentice Mulford, now Bruce Lipton, etc. Are we still on Dr. Harmer at the moment?
No. I'm just moving through some ideas here.
Okay, so we're on different disease causation presently. So
no. Yeah, this is we're past causation here. When I passed it in the sense I'm explaining why genes aren't the cause.
And so if I could just clarify with you, when we talked about the destructive emotion, would you mind tying those emotions into disease?
Well, they all of them lead to a wide variety of diseases. I can't tie one to one in particular. These are these long-term held emotions that people carry around with them that are stemming from a conflict shock of one or many things, and they just keep reliving them. They keep going over it over and over and reminding themselves of it. And this is what holds them down and leads to a whole wide variety of diseases.
Okay. Thank you.
Just wanted to hit the base of the base, right? That's what all of these are below 100 on the Hawkins scale. Make sense?
Genes then? Sure does.
Genes. Yeah. So we talk about them all the time. I wanted to throw in Dr. Bruce Lipton's definition because we blame everything on genes in today's society. And I like his description. He says a gene is like an architect's blueprint for building proteins. That's what a gene does. It builds a protein. So it basically takes instructions from the body and builds proteins. It isn't a thing that you're born with and you're destined to produce the rest of your life, according to Dr. Bruce Lipton. And the way I think about this is that your thoughts and emotions are the blueprint drawings and schematics. So that's what you're telling your gene to build. Here's how I want you to build this protein. I don't want you to build a perfect protein. I feel shame about this situation that happened, and I want you to build this shame-based protein. And ultimately,
I think that ties into our conscious eating course, where one of the key points that you mentioned is that the emotions that you're feeling while you're eating the food kind of dictate or inform the body what sort of body to create.
That's right. The guilty pleasure that we're eating, or the feeling of shame when we grab a bag of Doritos and munch them all down in one sitting, right? That's you're giving those thoughts and emotions you're having while you're eating them are your blueprints for your architect for the genes to build proteins. And they build proteins that are something that would make you feel guilty or feel ashamed.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's like if you feel guilty about the food, the reason you feel guilty about the food is you're guilty about the body that you imagine that you're creating. And if you're imagining that you're creating a body, well, that's what you're doing, right? The body comes from your I am, right? So if you're sitting there imagining a body and thinking, oh, I'll feel so like I'll feel so guilty. It's all tied in to one there. The feeling of the guilt of the body that you'll create is the body that you're creating while you're eating the food feeling that way. I know that was pretty wordy, but does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah, you're saying this is the body I'm going to create because this food I'm eating creates bodies like this.
Right. And, the establishment is telling you that you have to outsource your intellectual sovereignty to believe that. Right. When you're a baby, you didn't believe that eating certain foods, you were a blank slate. You didn't have that belief. The cabal, the establishment tells you that they give you the healthy food pyramid. They say, see these foods right here? If you eat those, you'll be fat or you'll be ugly.
Right.
And then you have to believe it. And if you believe it, then you'll feel guilty for eating them because you're imagining yourself creating that body.
That's right.
And feeling guilty about it.
So to top off, to round out Lipton's idea, I'm saying you are the architect. He says the gene is the architect, but you're the architect, tells the gene what to do. Mm-hmm. And it's your thoughts and emotions that create the blueprints, the drawings. So that's a nice little metaphor, I thought. I like that.
Makes sense to me.
It does indeed. I think I mentioned before, I have a niece who is 16 now. And that girl can eat 5 times what a grown male adult can eat. And she does. And she hadn't gained, she's grown 6 inches in the last 3 years. She hasn't gained a single pound. Never seen anything like it.
You're saying that even though she's taller, her weight is still the same?
Yeah, it's she's skinnier than she was 3 years ago, but 6 inches taller. But she's maybe gained a few pounds, but she's got 6 more inches of height on her. And she's like 85 pounds, 5'6". So, and she doesn't buy into what the establishment says at all. She just says, no, that's not true. I can eat what I want. And she does. Fun to watch. All right. So how are we getting down to the end of this? So I just want to throw out, closing out these 3 podcasts, there is a path toward healing for everybody. Whether or not we figure out the exact causation and we go through Dr. Hammer's work and we get all down to the bottom of it, there's a lot of work involved with that a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And it's, I certainly encourage people to look up things on learninggnm.com and see if they can start to make those connections. It's all very powerful. But ultimately, healing it's constructive use of your mind, really. And what most people have been indoctrinated into is a destructive use of their mind. And this is a chronic ailment. We don't know what causes it, but there's no cure. You're stuck with it. You're just going to have to take these drugs and ointments and things for the rest of your life. And then there's just this is destructive use of mental universal law. And it just starts with simply accepting this is a possibility, right? You can't build, heal, or return to health if the basis of your beliefs about your current condition are lies, unproven claims, half-truths, untruths, and lies. That makes sense? You can't, truth is health in one sense, right? Health is truth. So if you're sick, it's because you believe something that isn't true. That may be the simplest thing you can say. And looking for that belief sometimes is very difficult. But as we've suggested here, and I brought in 9 or 10 different different people who've talked about this, right? The power of forgiveness and forgetting is huge, right? The forgiving and forgetting thing wipes out shame and guilt, right? At the bottom of the scale. Hey, look, this thing happened, and you're taking back your power just by stating, I have the power to forgive somebody that did something wrong to me, right? you actually have that power. Whether or not you choose to use that power, it's up to you. And you don't need to forgive the person physically and in person. You can forgive them in your imagination. And to be clear, you're not forgiving the action, right? But you can forgive the person. And that can have tremendous healing effects for people who are, operating in these lower levels of consciousness. There's a ton of power to just letting go and allowing. This goes to this idea of being okay with what is. Just, I'm okay with it right now, right here, right now. I'm okay with everything. That can be tremendously healing for people. And ultimately, this comes from several different people that I've studied, mainly from the New Thought group. And I've heard many, many stories about how this simple phrase repeated over and over again helped people of all sorts of different problems. And the phrase is this: I am healthy, whole, perfect, and strong. Of course, it has that I am in front. I am healthy, whole, perfect, and strong. Not I am sick, I am weak, I'm never going to be cured. There's no cure for this. I'm going downhill, I'm getting old, I'm falling apart. All those thoughts need to be eradicated and replaced with this simple I am healthy, whole, perfect, and strong. It could be that simple. And I hope some people who listen to this give it a go, because it will work. I've just heard too many stories of how this particular affirmation, if you will, worked. So I want to leave everybody on this disease causation podcast with optimism and hope. And I hope this path of healing options gives some people some interesting things to contemplate, research, and consider. What do you say, Matt?
Absolutely. I just wanted to mention we have such good courses that help people put all this into experiential practice and actually heal. I mean, conscious eating heals eating disease and weight disease. Back Pain Miracle heals muscular and joint problems, and Take Your Power Back heals, well, what would you say? The root of it all.
Potentially everything.
Disempowerment.
Yeah, the sky's the limit. Yeah, the sky's the limit there. Yeah, where it's an attempt to point people towards greater truth. And if truth and health are one and the same, then you're bound to get some benefits in the realm of health as well.
And I mean, like we said before, we were talking about those examples. There was the woman with the drapes, right, and on my shoulder and stuff. We said, you have to make some mental or life development internally before those things resolve. And you could go and read all of learninggnm.com, which is a good thing. You could find out all that information rationally, but if you never progress that beyond the rational, it's just going to remain rational knowledge. And that's it. Whereas Take Your Power Back actually gives you that mental and inner empowerment evolution that actually makes these changes and transformations possible to actually physically manifest.
Right. A lot of it is about not dwelling on the past or the future. A big part of it. That's a big part of disease. Big part of it. Going back to, right, that the woman with the drapes was her memory of this, right? She was angry about him. She probably thought about him every now and then, but she couldn't let it go. She had to have those ugly drapes hanging in her family room. So that's the idea. Cool. All right. I wanted to tag one little thing onto the end of this, just because there's no other place to put this. Some feedback I've gotten from a few people on the Radical Take on Bacteria podcast. So I wanted to throw that in here at the end. And what a lot of people have done is they're still using Google. Sadly, maybe we haven't done a podcast enough on how detrimental that can be to you. But one of the top hits when people go hunting for this crazy idea that Brad talks about bacteria, and it wasn't my idea. Dr. Hammer is the one who really nailed this with his fourth biological law. The title of the paper is called "The Experiment That Proved Airborne Disease Transmission." And It's about an experiment done in the 1950s at Johns Hopkins University. And it reads like absolute proof, and there's no way you can deny this. And, it takes about, if you're thinking like I'm thinking, which a lot of people aren't doing, I'm thinking, all right, how is this not true? And so every sentence I read, I'm like saying, okay, let's put this thing together. So it was done over the course of 4 years. So that already is pretty weird. Well, a 4-year study. And what they did was they connected a bunch of air ducts to a tuberculosis ward, and they connected them over to
Wouldn't
this
you be
other
able to
room.
prove that in about a week?
Well, I'm getting to that. That shouldn't even take that long. But yeah, so they connect these. Yeah, Matt thinks like me, so we have some. You quickly realize it. So they connect these air ducts to this other room where these guinea pigs are. Well, I don't know what condition they're in. They're in cages, and 150 are in this room, and then they have 150 that are in this some other room somewhere else. I don't know. I don't know the precise details, but this is just a good example of how you can lie with statistics. And we just don't know anything at all about the circumstances of these. But the claim made is that only the guinea pigs that were connected to the air ducts of the TB ward got tuberculosis, while the control group, none of them ever got it. So once I get done explaining what Dr. Hammer says tuberculosis is, we'll hopefully be able to draw some conclusions that say this study is completely sketchy. Now, Matt pointed out the first obvious thing is, why would they do this over 4 years? Why couldn't they just directly introduce tuberculosis via normal transmission vectors straight to the guinea pigs, right? Put it in their food, their water, aerosolize it. They should have TB in a couple of days or a week, right? How complicated is that? Now, the next question then becomes, why didn't all the guinea pigs get tuberculosis? Because they didn't all get them that were in the tuberculosis ward. So that's a odd, what's the explanation that they have these guinea pigs have a strong immune system while the other ones don't? I mean, they're all have the same food and water and environment, like what gives these other guys? It could be genetics, but it's strange that they didn't all get tuberculosis, of course. And you can pick this study apart 10 different ways to Sunday, but it literally doesn't prove anything at all. And let's get Dr. Hammer's explanation. So Dr. Hammer's explanation is that when we have what's known as a death fright, so this is basically the worst conflict that you can have. You're afraid you're going to die. And, there's a lot of causes for that in today's world, not the least of which being when you go visit a doctor and they do a bunch of tests on you and they tell you, you've only got 2 years to live or 6 months to live, right? That's the ultimate death fright. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways that can happen, but a doctor telling you you're going to die in X number of months or years is a major death fright. And that's all it takes to fire up your psyche. And remember, your psyche doesn't operate in time. It operates immediately. And when you're afraid you're going to die, the quickest way to die is lack of oxygen, right? So it goes into action and begins proliferating new lung alveoli, so new lung tissue. And at the same time that it does this, I might add, it also produces tuberculosis mycobacteria. And their job is going to be to remove the excess lung alveoli once you resolve your death fright conflict. So back in the early part of the 20th century, there were a lot of people who got diagnosed with something called latent tuberculosis. Latent, meaning they found all these TB bacteria in these people's lungs and kidneys and livers, but they weren't doing anything, right? They weren't causing the damage that TB bacteria were known to allegedly cause. So this is the process. So now, as long as I'm afraid I'm going to die, I start to get lung cancer effectively. I'm getting excess tumors or tissue growing in my lungs. And this goes on for as long as I'm afraid I'm going to die. Now, the moment I'm not afraid I'm going to die, I go into the healing phase. I resolve the conflict. I've realized, guess what? I'm not going to die. I mean, it could be just a decision. I'm not going to let this thing kill me. And that can be all it takes to change this program. And what happens next is you get what's known as tuberculosis. And that was called consumption back in the day. And the symptoms of this, of course, are the coughing up of bloody sputum, Tissue could come up and out through the nose and the phlegm, the throat, and the mouth. And all it is these TB mycobacteria are eating away this temporary lung alveoli tissue. And that is what tuberculosis or consumption is. And no greater example than I'd come up with than Doc Holliday in Tombstone, who they called him a lunger in that movie. If you remember, hey, lunger, that was the derogatory term for someone who had tuberculosis. And you look at his lifestyle, right? He was playing poker, ripping people off and, getting into gunfights. He was a gunslinger. So that guy was in and out of death frights all the time throughout his life. And that's why he had tuberculosis. And eventually it killed him. Right? He had it for 30, 40, 50 years. And eventually he died of it. Could no longer hold up to it. But the idea is that going back to the guinea pig study, the guinea pigs that were in the tuberculosis ward could have been and were afraid for their lives in some way. They were afraid they were going to die. For something happened to them that did not happen to the control group that caused them to fear death.
Well, can I suggest my first guess why they were afraid they were going to die? Because the experimenters knew that they were connected up to the TB ward, and they were like, "Oh, you guys are going to die."
There you go.
Like they're just looking at him, kind of like, "Poor thing, right? Soon to die." And the guinea pig's like, "Why they treat me like that? What's going to happen?" Like, even if you're not communicating, they don't speak English, but an animal knows when you're treating it like it's going to die.
Right. So that's as good an explanation as you can get out of this. There could have been, they may have been treating him more poorly. Who knows what they were doing? Maybe they were injecting him with stuff. I mean, imagine some strange, monstrous human creature coming at you with a needle every other day and jabbing you in the butt with it or something, right? I mean, there's 1,000 different things that could have happened to those guinea pigs. And it could have also been that they just didn't, if they did find tuberculosis in one of the control guinea pigs, they just didn't tell anybody. That could have happened too, right? But the fact is that it's
the absurd things. You go ahead. Thought you were finished, but go ahead.
I was just going to say,
I was just going to. Okay, you finish. No, you go.
So you don't catch the TB mycobacteria. That's the point. You don't catch them. Your body produces them. Your body creates them when they're needed for a particular job. So go ahead.
I was just going to list the things that seem to me absurd in this thing are: you would not study this over a 4-year period. You would take a few days, you would get the TB bacteria, and you would put it in an aerosol and you would spray it on the guinea pigs. The end. That's all you would ever do. Right? That's one.
Yeah.
2, if the experimenters know that these ones are connected to the thing, and obviously all the experimenters believe that TB works in this way that you catch it, right? They are definitely treating those guinea pigs in all ways like they're going to die.
Right.
Like they are just like consciously connected to these guinea pigs with like, you're the dead ones, right? Those guinea pigs are going to be like going insane.
Right. They're going to resonate with those thoughts and feelings of the experimenters. That's right. They're going to be in resonance with it.
Yep.
You got it right. And, one of maybe the most important thing about all this is that if I aerosolized tuberculosis bacteria and sprayed it all over a bunch of guinea pigs, put it in their water and their food and everything, what a shock if I kill a guinea pig and do an autopsy on it and I find that there's TB mycobacteria in it. Of course there are. It breathed them up, it drank them up, it ate them up, right? They're going to be in the body. It shouldn't be a shock that if you douse them in TB, you're going to find it in their bodies.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, I haven't seen the experiment, but like maybe what they're saying by got the guinea pigs got tuberculosis, maybe they just found TB in them.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not that there's like this has, sick, dying guinea pigs. I mean, is that what happened, or did they just find?
I don't know I read the first couple pages and I'd had enough. I said, this is ridiculous.
I think one time we should go get a few papers, and just like have that as like the whole thing in the podcast where we're looking at this paper right now. So we can look at something from beginning to end and just kind of tear it apart and see what's right and what's wrong about it.
Right.
Some famous ones, Nobel Prize type stuff. Like when you and I sat down and looked at the measles one that the guy got the Nobel Prize for, that was like, whoa, that was a shocker.
Yeah, the Enders paper. He didn't win the prize for that paper, but yeah, he won it for something else. But yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean, it didn't. When you get done with it, you go, you didn't prove anything here. Right? Why would you?
No
Why
way.
would somebody hold this out as proof? And that's the same thing with this guinea pig studies. It just didn't prove anything at all. And more importantly, perhaps most importantly, is if this is the way things work, then it should have been repeated by hundreds of other people, and they should have been able to show here's 100 people who did this exact study the exact same way, followed all the protocols and produced the same results. So no study stands alone as this is it. No one else needs to do it because these guys figured it out. That's not how science works.
Mm-hmm.
Repeat things. And this one is the only one of its kind that I'm aware of. And it just doesn't prove anything. And if we go with Dr. Hammer's explanation, then things make even more sense, as you pointed out. So there you have it.
All right, then. Well, thanks very much, Brad.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hopefully you got some more information out of this that can be helpful in your life or the lives of friends or family. And we look forward to questions and feedback and having a podcast based on that in the near future.
Yeah, feel free to make comments on the website. We have comment taking software there. Okay.
Awesome.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.